When a young black girl spoke a single word during her adoption hearing, the entire courtroom fell silent. The judge, sensing something was terribly wrong, wasted no time and immediately called 911. What happened next is truly shocking. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now so you don't miss the twist that followed. The courtroom was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that buzzed in the ears and tightened the chest. In the center of the room, a long wooden table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. At one end sat the judge, a weathered man named Judge Latham, whose thick glasses magnified his piercing eyes. Opposite him sat David and Marianne Reed, hands clasped together, their smiles as bright and hopeful as a sunrise. Between them sat Zora, the young girl at the heart of today's proceedings. She was 11 but had a maturity in her gaze that seemed misplaced for someone her age. Her dark brown eyes surveyed the room carefully, lingering on the exits and the bailiff by the door. Zora's hands rested on her lap, folded neatly, but her fingers fidgeted, a silent rhythm only she understood. "Good afternoon, everyone," Judge Latham began, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. "We're here today to finalize the adoption of Zora Mae Carter by Mr. and Mrs. Reed." He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork in front of him. "This is a joyous occasion, one where we officially unite a child with a loving family." Marianne leaned closer to Zora, whispering, "This is it, sweetheart. After today, it's official." Her voice was warm and kind, but Zora didn't respond. She simply stared at the judge, her lips pressed tightly together. David cleared his throat. "We're so excited to welcome Zora into our family," he said, his voice firm but tinged with nervousness. "It's been a long journey, but we couldn't be happier to have her as our daughter." Judge Latham smiled faintly. "I'm sure you're all eager to move forward, but first, I'd like to hear from Zora herself." He turned his attention to the young girl. "Zora, would you like to say something? This is your moment." Zora's gaze flickered to her adoptive parents, then to the judge. Her shoulders tensed. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and the silence grew heavier with each passing second. The judge waited patiently, his pen poised over the papers on his desk. Finally, Zora opened her mouth. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Help." The word hung in the air, cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. Judge Latham froze, his pen halting mid-stroke. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low, almost uncertain he had heard her correctly. David frowned. "What did you say, Zora?" Marianne's smile faltered. "Sweetheart, is everything okay?" Zora didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed locked on the judge. "Help," she repeated, louder this time, her voice steady and deliberate. The courtroom shifted. The bailiff straightened by the door, his hand drifting instinctively toward his radio. Judge Latham removed his glasses, his expression hardening. "Zora," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Are you saying you need help? Do you feel unsafe?" David shot up from his seat, his face reddening. "What's going on here? Zora, this isn't funny." "David," Marianne hissed, grabbing his arm. "Calm down." Zora finally turned to face her adoptive parents. Her eyes were wide, filled with an emotion that was difficult to interpret. Fear? Defiance? Desperation? She didn't say another word, but her expression said enough. Judge Latham raised a hand. "Mr. Reed, please sit down. This is a serious matter." David reluctantly sank back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Marianne tried to smile, but her face betrayed her anxiety. "She's just nervous," she said quickly. "It's a big day for her." "Is that true, Zora?" the judge asked. "Are you simply nervous, or is there something you need to tell us?" Zora glanced toward the door, where the bailiff now stood fully alert. Her chest rose and fell as she took a deep breath. I need help," she said again, her voice breaking slightly. "Please, they're not who they say they are." The room erupted. "What?" David's voice boomed, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "What is she talking about?" "Zora!" Marianne's voice cracked. "Honey, that's not true. Why are you saying this?" Judge Latham slammed his gavel on the desk. "Order in the court!" He turned to the bailiff. Contact the authorities immediately. Wait a minute, David shouted, standing again. This is ridiculous. We've done nothing wrong. Sir, sit down, the bailiff barked, moving closer. Marianne began to cry, clutching David's arm. Please, Your Honor, this has to be some kind of misunderstanding. We love Zora. Zora stared at her feet, her small frame trembling slightly. Judge Latham watched her closely, his eyes narrowing. Zora, he said softly, can you tell me why you feel this way? Did something happen? Before Zora could answer, the heavy doors to the courtroom opened, and two uniformed officers entered. Their presence added a new layer of tension to the room. What's going on here? One of them asked, looking around. The judge gestured toward Zora. This child has made a statement that warrants investigation. Please escort her to a safe location until we can determine the facts. Marianne bolted to her feet, her hands raised in a pleading gesture. No! Please, you don't understand. She's been through so much. She's confused. David grabbed her arm. Stop talking, he hissed, his eyes darting toward the officers. The officers approached Zora, kneeling to meet her eye level. It's okay, sweetie, one of them said gently. We're here to help. You're safe with us. Zora looked up at them, her lips trembling. She nodded and stood, allowing them to guide her toward the door. Wait! Marianne cried, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. Don't take her! She's our daughter! Judge Latham slammed his gavel again. This proceeding is adjourned until further notice. As the officers escorted Zora out, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. Her eyes met Marianne's, then David's, and finally the judge's. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence spoke volumes. Outside the courtroom, the officers led Zora to a police car parked near the entrance. As they opened the door, Zora hesitated. She turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto a figure standing across the street. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence sent a chill down Zora's spine. Who's that? One of the officers asked, noticing her hesitation. Zora didn't answer. Instead, she climbed into the car, her heart pounding as the door closed behind her. The man across the street watched the car pull away, his expression still devoid of emotion. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. The courthouse buzzed with confusion and tension. Officers entered the room quickly, their footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. David and Marianne Reed stood by the judge's bench, their faces pale and drawn. David's jaw was set, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table, while Marianne clutched a tissue, her hands trembling. Detective Sarah Harris was the first to approach the judge. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features softened by a calm, empathetic demeanor. Her badge glinted as she pulled it from her jacket and addressed Judge Latham. I'm Detective Harris with Child Protective Services and Special Investigations. Can someone explain exactly what happened here? Judge Latham adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the paperwork scattered on his desk. The adoption hearing was proceeding as planned until the child, Zora, made a concerning statement. She claimed she needed help and implied her adoptive parents were not who they claimed to be. Harris glanced at David and Marianne, her expression neutral but attentive. What exactly did she say? She said, help, and then repeated it, the judge replied. She told the court, they're not who they say they are. David erupted. This is absurd. We've done everything by the book. Zora is just... She's confused, that's all. Marianne tugged at his sleeve. David, stop shouting. You're not helping. Harris raised a hand to calm the escalating emotions. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed, I understand this is upsetting, but I need to ask some questions to ensure Zora's safety. She motioned to a nearby officer. Where is the child now? Being transported to a secure location, the officer replied. She'll be under our care until further notice. Marianne's eyes filled with tears. You can't take her away from us. She's been through so much already. We're her parents. Ma'am, Harris said gently but firmly, this is a precaution. We're not accusing you of anything yet, but when a child expresses fear or concern like this, we have to investigate. Marianne slumped into her chair, sobbing quietly. David remained standing, his posture stiff with barely restrained anger. This is all some kind of mistake. Zora's just scared because of what she's been through in the system. We're the ones giving her a chance at a real family." Harris nodded slowly, her pen poised over a notepad. "I hear you, Mr. Reed. Let's talk about that. How long have you been fostering Zora?" 6 months, Marianne answered, her voice trembling. "We've worked so hard to make her feel safe and loved." "And during that time, has she ever expressed fear or discomfort around either of you?" Harris asked, her tone carefully measured. "No," David snapped. "Never. We've done everything for her. Therapy sessions, new clothes, even got her a dog, for crying out loud." Harris's pen paused. "A dog?" "Yes," Marianne interjected, eager to fill the silence. "A rescue. His name is Milo. Zora loves him. She lights up every time she's with him." Harris nodded, jotting down notes. "What about her past? Did she ever talk about why she was in the foster care system?" Marianne hesitated, glancing at David. "Not much. She's very quiet about it. Her file said her biological family was unstable." "Unstable how?" David sighed, his frustration evident. "Her parents were involved in criminal activity. That's all we know." Harris's brow furrowed as she scribbled something in her notebook. Before she could ask another question, a uniformed officer stepped into the room. "Detective Harris, you'll want to see this." Harris excused herself, following the officer out into the hallway. "What's going on?" The officer handed her a piece of paper. "It's a background report on the Reeds, something flagged during the routine check." Harris scanned the document, her sharp eyes narrowing. "A lawsuit?" "Yes, ma'am. It was sealed, but we dug it up. Turns out David Reed was involved in a civil suit a few years ago. Allegations of fraud and coercion. It was settled out of court." Harris's grip on the paper tightened. "Did Zora know about this?" "Unclear, but it's worth looking into." "There's something else," the officer added, lowering his voice. "A witness outside the courthouse reported seeing a man loitering near the entrance during the hearing. Said he looked suspicious, like he was watching the kid." "Did they get a description?" "Middle-aged, graying hair, stocky build. Sounded like he was there for a reason." Harris's mind raced. A man watching Zora during the hearing, combined with her plea for help, painted a troubling picture. "Put out an alert for that man. If he's still in the area, I want him detained for questioning." The officer nodded and walked off. Harris returned to the courtroom, her expression unreadable. "Detective," Judge Latham said as she entered, "what's your assessment?" Harris glanced at the Reeds, who looked back at her with a mix of hope and fear. "I can't make any determinations yet," she said carefully, "but we'll need to interview Zora thoroughly to understand her perspective. In the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Reed, I recommend you cooperate fully with our investigation. If there's nothing to hide, we'll clear this up quickly." Marianne nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. "Of course, anything you need." David, however, crossed his arms. "This is ridiculous. We're good people. We've done everything right. You'll see." Harris didn't respond. Instead, she turned to leave the room, her mind already spinning with unanswered questions. Outside, Zora sat in the back seat of a police car, staring out the window. The officers driving her exchanged quiet glances, unsure how to approach the visibly shaken girl. "Are you okay back there?" the officer in the passenger seat asked gently. Zora didn't respond. She was too focused on the man she had seen outside the courthouse. His face was burned into her memory, his cold eyes watching her every move. "Do you know who that man was?" the officer asked. Zora's voice was barely a whisper. "He's here for me." The officers exchanged worried looks. "Do you mean he's following you?" Zora nodded slowly. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her small frame tense with fear. "He always finds me," she said, her voice trembling. The officer driving adjusted the rearview mirror to look at her. "We're going to keep you safe, Zora. No one's going to hurt you." But Zora didn't look reassured. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "He always finds me." Back at the courthouse, Harris stood by the window, looking out at the street below. The bustling city carried on as usual, but her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a face that didn't belong. Somewhere out there, A piece of the puzzle was missing, and Harris knew she had to find it before it was too late. Zora sat in the corner of the brightly lit interrogation room at the police station, her small frame dwarfed by the cold metal chair. A glass of water sat untouched in front of her. Detective Sarah Harris, now seated across from her, studied the girl intently. There was something in Zora's eyes, a mixture of fear and weariness that didn't belong on a child's face. "Zora," Harris began, her tone soft but steady. "I know today has been overwhelming, but we need to talk. I want to help you, but I need you to trust me." Zora's gaze remained fixed on the table. Her fingers played with a loose thread on her sleeve. "They'll find me," she murmured. Harris leaned in slightly. "Who, Zora? Who will find you?" Zora's voice was barely audible. "Them." Harris glanced at her notepad, then back at the girl. "Are you talking about the man outside the courthouse?" Zora flinched, her fingers tightening around the thread. Her reaction didn't go unnoticed. "It's okay," Harris said gently. "You're safe here. No one can hurt you." Zora finally looked up, her dark eyes brimming with tears. "You don't understand. He always knows where I am. He's watching. Always watching." Harris sat back in her chair, her brows furrowed. "Who is he, Zora? Can you tell me his name?" Zora hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know his real name. We called him Grandfather." The detective's pen froze mid-scribble. "Grandfather?" Zora nodded. "He's not my real grandfather. He's something else." Harris leaned forward again, her voice steady. "Zora, what do you mean by something else? Is he dangerous?" Zora's eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. He's the leader. He's in charge of everything. If he finds me, he'll take me back." Harris's stomach tightened. "Take you back where?" Zora pressed her lips together, her tiny hands trembling. Harris could see that this wasn't just fear, it was terror, the kind that came from lived experience. "Zora, I need you to help me understand," Harris said, her voice calm but firm. "If you're afraid, it means something bad happened. And if we know what that is, we can stop him. We can keep you safe." Zora exhaled shakily, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying an invisible weight. She looked down at her lap. "Before the Reeds, I lived in a house. A big house, with lots of people. They called it a family, but it wasn't. It was bad." Harris felt a chill run down her spine. She kept her expression neutral. "What kind of bad things happened in the house, Zora?" Zora's voice was barely above a whisper. "They made us do things. Illegal things. They said if we didn't, we'd get punished. And if we tried to leave..." She trailed off, her throat working as she swallowed hard. "They threatened you?" Harris asked. Zora nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "They didn't just threaten. I saw what they did to people who disobeyed. Kids, adults, it didn't matter. Grandfather would just smile and tell everyone to watch." Harris tightened her grip on her pen. "Did this man, the one you called Grandfather, hurt you?" Zora hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He never touched me, but he scared me. He didn't have to hurt me. He just made everyone else do it." Harris's heart ached for the girl sitting across from her. She took a deep breath and asked, "How did you get away?" Zora blinked rapidly, her voice trembling. "One night there was a fight. Some of the older kids tried to escape. Grandfather, he locked them in a room. I heard screaming, but I didn't wait to see what happened. I just ran. I ran and ran until I found a police station." Harris scribbled notes furiously, her mind racing. Zora's story was horrifying, but it also explained her fear and her distrust of authority. The girl had lived through a nightmare. "What happened after you went to the police?" Harris asked. "They took me to a foster home," Zora replied. "I thought I was safe, but then Grandfather found me. He sent people to watch me. They didn't take me, but I knew they were waiting. That's when I stopped talking about it. I thought if I stayed quiet, they'd leave me alone." Harris frowned. "But they didn't, did they?" Zora shook her head. "I've seen them. Not every day, but enough. And today, I saw him. Outside the courthouse. He knows I'm here. Harris felt the weight of Zora's words settle over her. If the man Zora called grandfather was as dangerous as she described, this wasn't just a custody issue. It was a matter of life and death. Outside the interrogation room, officers watched the scene unfold through the one-way glass. Lieutenant Mason, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, crossed his arms. "What do you make of it?" he asked one of the officers. "She's scared, that's for sure," the officer replied. "But if half of what she's saying is true, then we've got a serious problem," Mason finished grimly. Back in the room, Harris leaned forward, her voice gentle but resolute. "Zora, I want to protect you. But to do that, I need more details. Can you tell me where this house is? Or how we can find grandfather?" Zora bit her lip, her hesitation evident. "I don't know where the house is. It's far from here. I only know it's near train tracks because I could hear them at night. But grandfather, he's always moving. He doesn't stay in one place." Harris sighed, her mind working quickly. "What about the other people, the kids? Do you know if they're still there?" Zora's face crumpled. "I don't know. I hope they're okay. But if grandfather's still in charge—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. As Harris stepped out of the room to confer with Mason, Zora remained seated, her hands clutching her knees. She felt exposed, vulnerable. She glanced at the mirror on the wall, knowing someone was watching her from the other side. Suddenly, a strange feeling washed over her. Her heart raced as she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Not from the mirror, but from somewhere beyond the station walls. She turned toward the window, her breath hitching. Across the street, parked in the shadow of a street lamp, was a car. A man sat inside, the dim glow of a cigarette illuminating his face. Grandfather. Detective Harris sat at her desk in the precinct. Her notes from Zora's interview spread before her like puzzle pieces. The girl's story was horrifying, yet there were still gaps that needed filling. As much as Harris wanted to focus on tracking down this mysterious grandfather, something about David and Marianne Reed didn't sit right with her. Her computer screen blinked to life as she accessed the Reeds' background checks. Her mind went back to the sealed civil suit flagged by her team. Fraud and coercion were serious accusations, especially for potential adoptive parents. Lieutenant Mason walked over, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Anything new?" Harris tapped her pen against her notepad. "Still looking. Zora's story about this grandfather is terrifying, but I can't shake the feeling that the Reeds aren't being entirely honest either." Mason nodded, taking a sip. "Can't blame you. The wife's an emotional wreck, but the husband? Too defensive. People with nothing to hide don't act like that." Harris leaned back in her chair. "Exactly. And this lawsuit, it could be nothing, or it could explain a lot." As if on cue, an officer approached with a folder. "Detective Harris, here's the unsealed file on David Reed." Harris opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. Her expression darkened. "This isn't good," she muttered. "What is it?" Mason asked. "David Reed worked for a nonprofit organization 5 years ago," Harris began. "They provided housing and support for vulnerable children, mostly from foster care. But then allegations surfaced. Families accused him of manipulating them into signing over guardianship in exchange for financial aid." Mason's brow furrowed. "Guardianship for what? What was he doing with those kids?" Harris flipped through the pages. The suit claimed he funneled them into questionable placements. Boarding schools, long-term facilities, even private individuals who paid donations to the nonprofit. It looks like trafficking, but there wasn't enough evidence to pursue criminal charges. He settled out of court and resigned quietly. Mason let out a low whistle. "And now he's trying to adopt? That's bold." Harris nodded, her jaw tightening. "Too bold. We need to dig deeper into his connection to Zora. If he's part of what she ran from, this could all be tied together." Meanwhile, David and Marianne Reed sat in a small interview room down the hall, waiting to be questioned again. Marianne dabbed at her tear-streaked face with a tissue, while David paced back and forth. "This is insane," David muttered, running a hand through his hair. "They're treating us like criminals. We're just trying to help that girl." Marianne sniffled. She's scared, David. She doesn't trust anyone. Maybe we pushed her too hard to feel comfortable with us. David paused, turning to face her. Don't blame yourself. This isn't our fault. She's making things up because she's scared, like you said. But what if she's not? Marianne whispered, her voice barely audible. David's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Marianne hesitated, wringing the tissue in her hands. What if she's telling the truth? What if someone really is after her? David exhaled sharply, sitting down beside her. Marianne, listen to me. We've done everything we were supposed to. We followed every rule, every procedure. Zora is ours now, and no one's going to take her away. You have to stop doubting that. Marianne nodded weakly, but said nothing. Detective Harris entered the room moments later, her demeanor calm but professional. She set a recorder on the table and took a seat across from the couple. Thank you for your patience, she began. I just have a few follow-up questions. David crossed his arms, his expression guarded. Haven't we answered enough already? Harris ignored his tone. You mentioned earlier that Zora didn't talk much about her past. Did she ever say anything specific about why she entered foster care? Marianne shook her head. No, she was always very quiet about it. We didn't want to pressure her. Harris turned her attention to David. And you? Did she ever say anything to you? David shrugged. Nothing I'd call unusual. She had nightmares sometimes, but that's normal for kids who've been through trauma. What kind of nightmares? Harris pressed. David shifted uncomfortably. She'd wake up screaming, kept saying someone was coming for her, but she never explained who or why. Marianne glanced at him, her face pale. Why didn't you tell me that? I didn't want to worry you, David replied quickly. Harris raised an eyebrow. When Zora made her statement in court today, you seemed angry, defensive even. Why is that? Because it's ridiculous, David snapped. We've done nothing but love and support her, and this is how she repays us? By accusing us of being something we're not? Marianne flinched at his outburst, her gaze dropping to the table. Mr. Reed, Harris said, her voice calm but firm, I've reviewed your history. I know about the lawsuit and the allegations against you at the nonprofit. David's face darkened. That was years ago. It has nothing to do with this. Doesn't it? Harris asked. You were accused of exploiting vulnerable children like Zora. That's not something I can ignore. Marianne's head snapped up, her eyes wide. What? David, what is she talking about? It's nothing, David said quickly, glaring at Harris. This is irrelevant and you know it. I don't think Zora would agree, Harris replied evenly. She said something very specific in court today. They're not who they say they are, so I have to ask, why would she say that? David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, an officer knocked on the door and stepped inside. Detective Harris, the officer said urgently, we've got a situation. You need to see this. Harris stood, her heart pounding. Excuse me, she said to the Reeds before following the officer into the hallway. Down the hall, Zora was sitting in the break room with a child services worker when the officer pulled Harris aside. We've confirmed a connection between David Reed and a known associate of the syndicate Zora described, the officer said. It's a man named Lionel Grayson. He matches the description of the guy outside the courthouse. Harris's stomach churned. You're telling me Zora's grandfather and David Reed might know each other? Not just that, the officer replied. Grayson was one of the donors involved in Reed's nonprofit scandal. He paid for guardianship of 2 kids who disappeared shortly after. Harris felt a wave of cold anger. This isn't just about Zora's adoption. It's bigger than that. She glanced down the hall, her eyes narrowing, as she caught sight of David through the glass window of the interview room. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched. Bring him in for questioning, Harris said. We're not letting him walk out of here. As the officer moved to carry out her orders, Harris turned her attention back to Zora. The girl looked up. We'll get to the bottom of this, Zora, Harris murmured under her breath. I promise. The precinct bustled with activity, but Zora's small frame in the corner of the break room remained still. She sat on the couch, hugging a pillow as if it could protect her. The child services worker, a woman named Linda, tried to engage her in conversation, but Zora only nodded or shook her head in response. Detective Harris stood in the hallway, speaking quietly with Lieutenant Mason. "We've got to move quickly," Harris said. "If David Reed's connection to Lionel Grayson, grandfather, is solid, Zora is in even more danger than we thought. He might have been trying to get her back into the syndicate." Mason nodded. "And if Zora's right, and Grayson already knows where she is—" Harris didn't let him finish. "We're not taking chances. I want Zora placed in a secure safe house tonight. Call in extra officers if you need to." "Understood," Mason said. Inside the break room, Zora shifted uneasily. She glanced out the window, her eyes darting to the street below. Her chest tightened when she saw a familiar figure leaning against a car. He wasn't hiding this time. Lionel Grayson, grandfather, was there smoking a cigarette, his cold eyes locked on the building. Zora froze, her breath catching in her throat. Linda noticed her sudden stillness. "Zora, sweetie, what's wrong?" Zora shook her head quickly. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's here?" Linda asked, leaning closer. Zora bolted to her feet, panic taking over. "Grandfather!" she screamed. Linda turned to the window, her face paling. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to call for help. "Detective Harris?" But it was too late. A loud crash echoed through the station as the lights flickered. Somewhere in the building, the fire alarm blared, adding to the chaos. Detective Harris and Mason were halfway down the hall when they heard the commotion. Harris's radio crackled with frantic voices. "Break in at the east entrance. We've got unauthorized personnel inside the building." Harris's stomach sank. "They're here for her," she muttered, taking off toward the break room. In the chaos, two masked men stormed into the break room, weapons drawn. Zora screamed, backing into a corner. "Don't hurt her," Linda pleaded, stepping in front of Zora. The taller of the two men shoved Linda aside, grabbing Zora by the arm. "Come on, kid, time to go." "No!" Zora struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the man's grip was strong. Linda lunged at them, clawing at the man's arm. "Let her go!" The second man swung the butt of his gun, hitting Linda in the side of the head. She crumpled to the floor as Zora screamed louder. Harris burst into the break room seconds later, her gun drawn. "Freeze!" she shouted. The men hesitated, but the taller one tightened his grip on Zora. "Back off, lady. This doesn't concern you." "You're not taking her anywhere," Harris said, her voice steady. "Put the kid down and step away." The shorter man moved toward Harris, his weapon raised. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Harris didn't flinch. "And I wouldn't underestimate me." For a moment the room was still, the only sound the distant blare of the fire alarm. Then the taller man yanked Zora toward the door. Harris fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Last chance. Let her go." The men exchanged a glance, before the shorter one pulled a smoke grenade from his pocket, tossing it into the room. Thick, choking smoke filled the air, clouding Harris's vision. She coughed, blinking against the stinging haze. When the smoke cleared, Zora and the men were gone. Outside the station, a black van screeched to a halt by the curb. The taller man shoved Zora inside as Grayson, seated in the driver's seat, turned to look at her. "You've been a very bad girl, Zora," he said, his voice calm and menacing. "Running away like that. You know it's pointless." Zora's heart raced, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone." Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? You belong to me. Always have, always will." The van roared to life, speeding off into the night. Harris stumbled out of the precinct, coughing from the lingering smoke. "They took her," she said, her voice hoarse. Mason ran up behind her. "Which way did they go?" Harris scanned the street, her sharp eyes catching sight of the van turning a corner. "There!" She sprinted to her car, Mason jumping into the passenger seat. The engine roared as Harris tore after the van, weaving through traffic with a single-minded focus. Inside the van, Zora struggled against her restraints. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Grayson smirked. "And who's going to stop me? That detective? She's too late." Zora glared at him, her fear momentarily overtaken by anger. "You don't scare me anymore." Grayson's smirk faded. "You should be scared, little girl. You're coming home, whether you like it or not." Harris's car closed the distance, her siren wailing. Mason radioed for backup, his voice tense. "This is Unit 12 in pursuit of a black van heading west on 5th Street. Possible child abduction. Request immediate assistance." The van swerved suddenly, veering down a narrow alley. Harris followed, the tires screeching as she navigated the tight space. "They're trying to lose us," Mason muttered, gripping the dashboard. "They won't," Harris said through gritted teeth. The chase ended abruptly when the van skidded to a halt near an abandoned warehouse. Grayson and the two men jumped out, dragging Zora with them. Harris parked a safe distance away, her gun drawn as she and Mason exited the car. "Zora!" she called out. "Help!" Zora cried, her voice echoing in the night. Grayson smirked, holding Zora close. "Stay back, detective, or the girl gets hurt." Harris didn't lower her weapon. "Let her go, Grayson. It's over." Grayson laughed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Harris's jaw tightened. "Neither do you." Before Grayson could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived. Grayson cursed under his breath. "Looks like we'll have to reschedule." He pushed Zora toward Harris before disappearing into the warehouse with his men. Harris caught Zora, holding her tightly. "I've got you," she said softly. Zora clung to her, sobbing. "He's going to come back. He always comes back." "Not this time," Harris promised, her eyes hard as she stared after Grayson. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The abandoned warehouse loomed ominously in the distance as the sound of police sirens faded into the night. Officers surrounded the area, forming a tight perimeter. Inside the car, Detective Harris held Zora close, gently stroking her hair as the girl's trembling began to subside. "You're safe now," Harris murmured. Zora shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll come back. He always does." Harris leaned back to look into her eyes. "Not this time. I promise you, Zora. We're going to stop him." Zora stared at her, searching for reassurance. But before she could respond, the door to the car opened. Lieutenant Mason stood there, his expression grim. "Harris, we've got a problem," he said. "What now?" Harris asked, her tone sharp. Mason motioned for her to step aside. "We found something inside the van. You'll want to see this." Harris handed Zora over to a child services officer, making sure she was safely escorted to a nearby police cruiser. Then, following Mason, she approached the open doors of the van. An officer was photographing the interior, but what immediately caught Harris's attention was the pile of documents scattered across the floor. "What are we looking at?" she asked, crouching to examine the papers. Mason pointed to a stack of photographs clipped to one of the folders. "This." Harris picked up the folder, flipping through the photos. Each one showed a child, young boys and girls, their faces blank with fear. The images were labeled with names, dates, and what appeared to be transaction numbers. "Trafficking," Harris muttered, her jaw tightening. "That's not all," Mason said, handing her another sheet. "Look at this." Harris scanned the page, her heart sinking as she recognized a familiar name, David Reed. "What the hell is this?" Harris whispered. "It's a ledger," Mason explained. "Dates, payments, and what looks like client information. Reed's name shows up more than once." Harris stared at the page, her mind racing. He's been working with Grayson this whole time. The adoption wasn't about giving Zora a home. It was about getting her back under their control. Mason nodded grimly. "And there's more. We traced some of the names on the list. A few are linked to missing children's cases going back years. Grayson's operation isn't just local, it's national." Harris stood, clutching the folder tightly. "We need to bring Reed in now. If he's tied to this, there's no way he's walking out of here." Back at the precinct, David Reed sat in an interrogation room, his arms crossed and his face a mask of defiance. Marianne was in a separate room, sobbing quietly as she waited for someone to tell her what was happening. When Harris entered the room, David didn't bother to look up. "You've made a big mistake," he said coldly. "Have I?" Harris placed the folder on the table, opening it to reveal the photos and ledger. She slid it across to him. "Care to explain this?" David glanced at the papers, his expression flickering for a split second before returning to its practiced calm. "I don't know what that is." "Don't insult my intelligence," Harris said, her voice sharp. We know about your connections to Lionel Grayson. We know about the nonprofit scandal. And now we have evidence tying you directly to his trafficking operation. You've been working with him for years, haven't you? David leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk. You've got nothing. Really? Harris pulled out another sheet from the folder. This is a financial statement showing a payment made to your account 6 months ago, the same month you began fostering Zora. Care to guess where it came from? David's smirk faltered. Grayson paid you to adopt her, Harris continued, her voice cold. She wasn't just some random child you wanted to help. She was a target, and you planned to deliver her right into his hands. David slammed his hands on the table, leaning forward. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, Harris shot back. And I'm willing to bet Marianne doesn't know the full story, does she? Should I go ask her about it? David's jaw tightened. Leave her out of this. She's already in it, Harris replied. And if you don't start talking, I'm going to make sure she goes down with you. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then David exhaled sharply, slumping back in his chair. You don't get it, he said bitterly. You think I wanted to be involved in this? I didn't have a choice. Harris raised an eyebrow. No choice. You expect me to believe that? David's gaze hardened. You don't know what Grayson is capable of. He doesn't just control people, he owns them. He finds your weakness, and he exploits it until you're nothing. Is that what happened to you? Harris asked. David hesitated, then nodded. He approached me after the lawsuit. I thought I was done for. I couldn't get a job, couldn't support my family. Then Grayson came along and offered me a deal. He said he'd make my problems disappear if I helped him. And you agreed, Harris said, her voice dripping with disgust. David looked away. At first it was just small things, finding placements for kids, keeping things off the books, but then he started asking for more. By the time I realized what I'd gotten into, it was too late. I couldn't get out. What about Zora? Harris pressed. Why her? David's face twisted. Grayson wanted her back. He said she was important to the operation, but she ran away before he could finish, whatever it was he was planning. And you didn't think to warn anyone? Harris snapped. David laughed bitterly. Warn who? The cops? Grayson has people everywhere. There's no escaping him. Maybe not for you, Harris said coldly, but Zora deserves better than this. In another part of the precinct, Zora sat with Linda, watching as officers moved through the station. Her eyes were tired, her body slumped against the chair. Are they going to catch him? She asked softly. Linda squeezed her hand. Detective Harris is doing everything she can. Zora nodded but didn't look convinced. She stared at the floor, her voice trembling. He'll never stop. He always finds me. Harris entered the room moments later, her expression grim but determined. Zora, I need your help, she said gently. Zora looked up, her eyes wide. Help? How? We think Grayson has a headquarters, a place where he keeps all the kids he's taken, Harris explained. If we can find it, we can shut him down for good. But we need to know everything you remember about the house where he kept you. Zora hesitated, fear flashing across her face. You're brave, Zora, Harris said, kneeling in front of her. You've already escaped him once. Now you can help make sure he never hurts anyone else again. Zora took a deep breath, her hands trembling. There was a train, she whispered. You could hear it at night. And there were symbols on the walls, like stars, but not really. Harris's heart raced. Good. That's good. Do you remember anything else? Zora nodded slowly. There was a room, a big room with cages, and grandfather, he always sat in the middle, watching us. Harris's stomach turned, but she kept her expression steady. Thank you, Zora. That helps a lot. As Harris stood, Zora grabbed her hand. Promise me he won't get away. Harris squeezed her hand tightly. I promise. The old industrial district was eerily silent, the rows of abandoned warehouses standing like sentinels in the dim moonlight. Harris crouched behind a rusted shipping container, her earpiece crackling softly. We have eyes on the target, Mason's voice came through. Grayson's inside, along with at least 5 others. No sign of the kids yet. Harris adjusted her bulletproof vest, gripping her weapon tightly. Stay sharp. This guy is dangerous, and he knows how to cover his tracks. In the surveillance van parked a block away, Zora sat beside Linda and another officer, her small hands clenched in her lap. The decision to bring her this close to the operation had been heavily debated, but Zora's insistence that she could identify the building and provide crucial details had won out. That's it, Zora had said when they passed the warehouse earlier. That's where he took me. Now, Harris and her team moved silently toward the building, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. Harris's heart pounded in her chest, the stakes of the operation weighing heavily on her shoulders. Inside the warehouse, Lionel Grayson sat at a makeshift desk in the center of the cavernous space. The glow of a single overhead light cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the rows of cages pushed against the walls. Most were empty, but a few held young children huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Grayson lit a cigar, the smoke curling around his face as he examined a stack of papers in front of him. "It's been a rough night," he muttered, glancing at one of his henchmen. "First, we lose the girl, and now we've got cops sniffing around. Tighten security. I don't want any more surprises." The man nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the nearest cage. A boy no older than 8 stared back at him, his small hands gripping the bars. Grayson smirked. "Don't worry, kid. You'll be on your way to a new home soon enough." Outside, Harris signaled to her team. "Mason, you and the second unit cover the rear. I'll take point with entry team 1. We go in quiet until we can secure the children." "Roger that," Mason replied. The team moved into position, their weapons drawn. Harris pressed her ear to the warehouse door, listening for any sounds from within. Satisfied, she motioned to the officer beside her, who quietly picked the lock. The door creaked open, and Harris stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and smoke. She could hear faint voices and the occasional whimper of a child. She gestured for her team to spread out, their movements swift and silent. Grayson's voice carried through the space as he barked orders at his men. "Load the trucks. We're moving out in 20 minutes. I'm not sticking around for the cops to catch up." Harris crept closer, using the shadows to her advantage. She spotted Grayson near the center of the room, his back turned to her. Around him, several armed men worked quickly to dismantle the operation. Her grip on her weapon tightened. "Not this time, Grayson." She motioned to her team, who fanned out to surround the area. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the shadows, her voice ringing through the warehouse. "Police! Drop your weapons and get on the ground!" Chaos erupted. Grayson spun around, his face twisting into a snarl. "Take them out!" he shouted. His men opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the cavernous space. Harris dove behind a stack of crates, returning fire as her team engaged the attackers. In the surveillance van, Zora flinched at the sound of the gunfire. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Linda placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're doing everything they can to stop him. Just stay here, okay?" Zora nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the warehouse in the distance. Back inside, Harris moved with precision, her focus unwavering. She spotted Grayson making a break for the side door and pursued him, her boots pounding against the concrete floor. "Grayson!" she shouted. "Stop!" Grayson ignored her, disappearing through the door and into the night. Harris followed, emerging into an alley behind the warehouse. Grayson turned to face her, a pistol in his hand. "You should have stayed out of this, detective," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "And you should have known better than to underestimate me," Harris shot back, her weapon trained on him. They stood there for a tense moment, the air crackling with unspoken threats. "You think you've won?" Grayson sneered. "You take me down and someone else will take my place. That's how this works." "Not tonight," Harris said, her finger tightening on the trigger. Before Grayson could fire, Mason appeared behind him, his weapon drawn. "Drop it, Grayson. It's over." Realizing he was outnumbered, Grayson let out a frustrated growl and dropped his gun. Harris moved in quickly, cuffing him as Mason provided cover. "You're done, Grayson," she said, her voice firm. "You'll never hurt another child again." Back in the warehouse, the rest of the team secured the area. rescuing the children and apprehending the remaining suspects. The children were led out one by one, their faces pale, but filled with cautious hope. Zora watched from the van as the officers emerged, her heart lifting when she saw the rescued kids. Tears streamed down her face as she realized Grayson's reign of terror was finally over. Hours later, back at the precinct, Harris sat with Zora in her office. The girl looked up at her, a small, hesitant smile playing on her lips. "You did it," Zora said softly. "We did it," Harris corrected, smiling back. "You were brave, Zora. You helped us stop him." Zora nodded, her eyes shining with relief. "Does this mean it's over?" Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over. He's not coming back." Zora let out a shaky breath, her small frame relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. Zora didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like it was hers to decide. And that was enough. Alright guys, we've come to the end of this video, and if you enjoyed it, do well to click on the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to check other videos on our playlist. We've got some amazing stories for you. See you in our next video.